Right, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to a new video and a new series. I'm very excited to kick this one off. The video series is titled Where You're Letting Them Off the Hook. That's as catchy a title as I could come up with. And this particular video, we're going to start with 3-bet pots in position as the pre-flop caller. So my idea for this series overall is, generally speaking, small stakes regs, mid stakes regs, still in 2026, trend passive, right? Everyone trends not aggressive enough in the vast majority of spots. And this series, I'm hoping to stop that. Well, stop that for some of you. At the end of the day, if I'm single-handedly improving the small and mid-stakes population, then I'm probably overrating my importance in the poker pyramid. But there's a lot of common spots that come up really often whereby people trend to passive. And this series is going to be an exploration of those spots. And I'm not even going to be talking too exploitatively here. It's all just going to be like theory baselines. So today the spot is 3-bet pots in position, as I say, as the pre-flop caller, with the focus on playing versus a flop check. So we're going to look at flop stabbing relatively briefly, what that looks like in terms of like global frequencies, in terms of how close the EVs are and being flexible, in terms of stab sizing and so on. Then we're going to play against a check call, which of course happens very often. So when our opponent check calls and then checks to us on the turn, we are going to look at turn barreling, and we're going to show you the baselines for what the solver does and how aggressive it likes to be in this situation. Spoiler alert, you're not aggressive enough here, and it's very hard to be, but it's very fun. And then the natural progression is we'll look at the turn check call and look at following through on the river. Same logic, same idea. How wide can you bluff? How thin can you go for value? And so on and so on. And again, we're just looking at baselines. We're looking at theory baselines in this particular spot. There's a few tricks of the trade where you can identify these spots in-game in your opponent, and you can empty the clip, long story short. So, as I say, very excited to kick this video series off. There'll be more to come from me in the coming weeks with regards to this, but let's start with 3-bet pots in position as the pre-flop caller. Grab yourself your drink of choice, and I'll see you on the other side. Right, so logically, it makes sense to start with the flop, doesn't it? Now, as mentioned for this video series, and as I say, this particular video, it's all about finding more aggression. So I'm not going to go too deep into defending versus c-bets or defending versus turn barrels and so on. The focus is going to be more facing a check from our opponent. Now, flop stabbing is already, I think, a spot where a lot of people tend to marginally get it wrong. And we don't need to be too accurate here on the flop because the solver tends to be very flexible with regards to how it stabs versus a check. Now, reason is that EVs run very close when your opponent checks, and we tend to stab roughly according to the global frequency with each bucket of hand. I don't think in general people do a terrible job with this, but I do think there are regions of hand that people understab, and I think that a lot of that is down to overestimating showdown value, misunderstanding the plan for the turn and the river and the rest of the hand, and yeah, I'd say generally just not having a kind of concrete plan in place for turn and river. Now, in terms of stab size, we generally tend to stab small across most textures. The exception tends to be double Broadway boards, and this is to go after our opponent's very ace high and overcard heavy range. We are going to go into a sim in a second and illustrate this. My top bit of advice for flop stabbing is to be flexible and understand there are many lines where our range will perform well, And there's no real need to go super hard with an exploit just yet. Okay, now a lot of people tend to think about exploiting and go, well, Simon, look, if they've checked to us, they're probably going to undercheck raise versus a stab. They might overfold versus a stab. Therefore, I'm going to stab my range because I node locked this in GTO Wizard once upon a time. It told me I could stab my range, so I will do so. I don't tend to follow that train of thought, if you will, because you've only node locked one street and there's the rest of the tree to consider. So in general, when I'm looking to exploit my opponents, I'll do the most exploiting on the river because there's no future streets to come and exploits tend to be very, very binary. But when you're arriving to the flop, if you imagine you're in your car and you're at an intersection, you have the option of turning left. You have the option of going straight on. You could turn right or you could make a U-turn, right? And there are exploits available down each of these roads if you want. Now, you of course could just drive straight on and take the immediate exploit of, hey, you know, they're going to undercheck raise or they're going to overfold versus the stab, so I'm just going to do that. But what that potentially misses is, as I say, maybe turning left and checking back, and then your opponent's going to do a very bad job of delay c-betting. They're not going to be aggressive enough there, or they might not delay c-bet, check twice, and then overfold to a turn delay. Or they might check twice, we check back, and then they might overfold to a river bet in the check line. There's a million things that can happen, and because you're just at the start of the hand, basically, I don't think you want to ignore all the potential exploits down each particular road and just, as I say, drive straight on. So be flexible, right? Understand that there's exploits in each particular line, and the solver, if we were to node lock literally every single street, would also calculate this. And what you'd often find is, honestly, something not too dissimilar to theory, whereby EVs, again, between betting and checking are actually going to run pretty close. Okay. So let's just look at a sim. I want to just focus in particular on here how close the EVs run and what kind of hands we immediately go after with our stab size. So what you've got here, first of all, is an aggregate report. Button versus small blind, the most common 3-bet pot spot that you're going to see. I've put a check into the solver here, and you can see it's got all the different sizes. Globally, our stabbing frequency is in and around 50%, and overall, we tend to stab small more than we tend to stab big. And the reason behind this is we just want to kind of focus on our opponent's checking range, right? So I'm going to AI solve this at this point. Right, so the board comes down 8-7-3. Out of position is very, very incentivized to make this a 2-street game and leverage their overpair advantage and try to get stacks in very, very quickly because the board is very, very dynamic and Jacks doesn't want 3 streets, right? So it's going to bet a big size very often and then shove the turn. If it does decide to check and we stab, it's going to check raise, as you can see, extremely aggressively. Because same thing, right? It wants a 2-street game. It wants the hand to be over. It's a vulnerable hand. Money to go in now and get it in versus 8x, 7x, flush draws, whatever it might be. So when our opponent does check, the interesting thing to consider here is, as I say, what is the bulk of their checking range, right? So if we go check and then stab, all you're going to see here is the bulk of out of position's checking range is ace high, king high, and no mate hand. Right, this adds up to 75% of the out of position player's range, and you can see that stabbing small really messes with that region of hand. Okay, so on most textures, whether it's, you know, a middle and low board like this, or a single Broadway, or a paired board, small stabs tend to be very, very good because the out of position player's range is almost always very, very, very top left-hand corner heavy, very high card driven, right? So the board could be 6-6-3, for example, similar strategy from out of position, polar or check. We stabbed small, and you can see again, similar region of hand, right? Again, maths will fail me here. What's that? 70, that's 80% of out of position players' range at this point is ace high or worse, right? And as you can see, this is struggling versus a small size in this particular spot. So when you stab small, if our opponent has a lot of high cards or ace highs in their range that miss. Now, the exception to the rule is very much going to be something along the lines of like king jack 4, right? Whereby this is going to look very different because the out of position player's range is no longer dominated by high cards, because high cards have something, right? Even if you have something along the lines of, say, ace queen or queen 10 or whatever it is, that's a high equity draw at this point. So the solver again here polarizes, similar sort of vibe. It's a very dynamic board. It wants to leverage the fact that it's got aces and ace king, and in position does not very often. But the in position player's stabbing strategy is a lot more infrequent because, hey, we're not doing very well on king jack 4 overall. But you can see it's also a size up because you need to go bigger to go after different portions of your opponent's range, right? So you can see here the big makeup of the out of position player's range is not so much high cards and ace highs. It's a lot more second pair, third pair, and still some ace highs, right? So in order to get indifference from the bulk of your opponent's range, like 10s, 9s, and so on, ace jack, ace 10 are very close on the flop. Well, not that close, but they're not loving their life at the end of the day. You need to stab bigger. So double Broadway boards are very much sort of the exception to the rule. Generally, you stab small, but when your opponent in the small blind or in the big blind or whatever has a lot of cards that kind of congregate around the board, you generally want to go a bit bigger. So ace queen 4, very similar. And then you, as I say, stab very, very polarized. So king jack 4, you're going to start stabbing king queen, king jack, king 10, pocket 4s and stuff like that for value, but you're going to do a lot of checking overall as well. What was the other point I wanted to make? Let's just go back to my presentation. EVs run very close. There we go. So if we go and look at that, what was it, 873 or something like that? If we look at the 873 board, right, you'll see that again, you're tending to stab 50-50. That's always the kind of rough idea that I have in my head. And with a lot of hands, barring the top end, right, you tend to stab very, very close to the global frequency. So you can see something like third pair, so 6s, 5s, 4s, roughly 50-50, right? Second pair, 7-6, 50-50. Top pair, roughly 50-50. Over pairs are stabbing an awful lot more. These are hands that really do benefit from popping money into the pot now. Likewise, sets and two pairs tend to fast play a little bit more, of course. But the region of hand I think most people tend to get a little bit wrong is very much the ace high region, right? It's very, very easy to check back ace jack, to check back ace queen, to check back ace king, ace 9, and so on and so on. We tend to think ace high, we tend to think showdown value. We tend to think third pairs and stuff like that. We tend to think showdown value. And granted, these are stabbing less than other hands in the range, but you can see it's still pretty close to the global frequency, right, of 50-50. And if you look at something like pocket sixes, you can see that the EVs, as I say, are almost equal, right? And if you look at something like ace queen or ace jack, again, the EVs are almost equal, okay? And a lot of people don't stab ace jack because they kind of just think 873, why would I stab, right? And the answer comes later because, believe it or not, you're not stabbing to showdown. You're stabbing to blast this off at a very high frequency, which we'll see in a second. But don't make this mistake, essentially. Understand that there aren't that many hands which are very clear bets, right? If you have even like pocket threes, for example, right, the EVs are still extremely close between bet and check. Okay, so it's not, you've fought to set, fantastic, congratulations, but it's not a slam dunk bet. Look, if you just eyeball the range, right, is there even a hand which is a pure bet in here? I can't really see one. Yeah, I can't see one. So that's because betting and checking are very, very close in EV, All right, so both lines are going to be good. Again, you're at that intersection, right? You can turn left, you can go straight on. Lots of these hands perform very, very well in the delay. Lots of these hands perform very, very well in the stab. Right, that covers that. Let's move on to the turn. All right, okay, part 2. This is where it gets fun. This is where it gets interesting. Turn barreling. So we stabbed the flop. Our opponent has check called, and our opponent checks to us on the turn, and the action is up to us. Some general guidelines, and we'll dive into the solver in a second with this. Always be very conscious, as we saw on the flop, of the bulk of villain's range that check calls the flop. And then what we want to do is we want to construct our turn barreling strategy to mess with that region. Okay? We want to understand basically that in this check call line, villain will always be very, very capped overall, both in reality and in theory. And therefore, we're going to be hyper aggressive. My caps lock was turned on purpose for those 2 words, with both our value and our bluffs. Right? A common mistake I see people making is the 3rd point, whereby we do not want to overestimate our showdown value with the ace high region. Okay, ace high that goes into the flop stab is not in there to check down, right? Ace high that goes into the flop stab very often is in there to continue bluffing on the turn and often on the river. Okay, this turn barreling spot in general is really the kind of fork in the road where I keep going with the road analogies, don't I? But it's really where I tend to see people making an awful lot of mistakes. The solver in this situation is extremely aggressive and humans are nowhere near it. And I think what that boils down to is, firstly, as I mentioned, they don't really know the theory because they don't tend to study this particular line all that much. Secondly, I think there's a bit of a mentality leak in there as well, whereby a lot of people don't feel like they have permission to be aggressive. Because we're the pre-flop caller, a lot of the time people tend to get monsters under the bed and go, well, if I barrel the turn, he knows that I'm going to be very, very bluff heavy in this spot. We tend to fear getting stationed down. We tend to overestimate how much top end value villain has in this particular line, and so on and so on. Just because we called pre-flop does not mean that we can't be aggressive later on, right? We stabbed the flop with a very, very merged range, as we've just previously seen. But on the turn, villain, has a very, very, very defined and capped range. And we need to go after that. And the beauty of this spot is we can go after that with merciless aggression. So let's go back into the solver and let's show you. So let's just keep the board the same. I'll do a single Broadway board or a paired board in a second to illustrate this. But let's start with our opponent's check raising range again. So as you can see on 8-7-3, the solver likes raising very small here, with the idea of basically messing with our own overcards in this situation. So they want to, as mentioned, check raise their overpairs extremely aggressively because they want the money to go in very, very quickly. If you look at the equity of, say, jacks, of, say, queens, of, say, kings, you're hovering around this 70 to 80% region. That's always the sweet spot for fast playing in 3-bet pots, right? You're not loving your life. And jacks is a very, very good hand, but a very, very vulnerable hand to future aggression. So it kind of just wants to shut its eyes, check raise, and then stick the money in on the vast majority of turns. So our opponent will also check raise 8x aggressively. They'll check raise their bluffs very aggressively. So you can see, flush draws check raising. You can see gut shots check raising, straight draws check raising. The ace high region, right, has to check raise some of the time, and so on and so on. Now, when our opponent calls, let's roll off a 9, shall we? What, again, I want you to pay attention to here is the bulk of villain's range at this point. Okay, so they've check called the flop. You can eyeball it, right? You can see all of this ace high here. But again, go over to the right-hand side and just look at the percentages. And you can see the villain's range at this point is ace high. Okay, so what your turn strategy is going to be, in theory, is going to be constructed in a way to force this bulk of villain's range into indifference on the turn. So what you can see here is the button actually just keeps going relatively small to medium, right, with a B40 size, because that's the size that forces ace high into the blender, right? You can see if we go B40 on the turn, they have to fold ace queen, right? Unless it's a flush draw, they have to be very indifferent with ace king. They're forced to check call again with ace jack, which is, as I say, just, you know, pair plus, sorry, not pair plus, ace high plus a gut shot. They're meant to check raise with some ace 10 and so on and so on. This region is really, really, really struggling versus a B40 size. There's even king high, similar thing where, you know, they have to check, is it check jam? Yeah, they have to check jam king 10. They have to check jam king jack. They have to check jam king 6 of clubs, which is not exactly appetizing at the end of the day. But you can see how much we mess with this region, right, by betting this size. So the size isn't, you know, the accuracy of the size you pick isn't overly important. All you really want to do is, as I say, think about, all right, my opponent's check called the flop. The 9 has come on the turn. We need to construct a strategy which messes with the bulk of villain's range. Now, in terms of frequency, look at that. The solver continues to bet on this turn 80% of the time. If I, just to go off on a slight tangent here, if I see a flop strategy, right, single raise pot in position, and the board is like king 7-3 rainbow, for example, very often you're going to see a betting frequency of like 80%, something along those lines. What I would do in that situation is I would simplify that and I would range bet, all right, which a lot of other people do as well. The thing is, on the turn here, you could argue for that same simplification, right? This strategy on the turn is so unbelievably aggressive, and this is where a lot of people fall down because they don't realize that you get to be this aggressive. Okay, so if I'm going to highlight third pair and second pair, right, in this situation. So we're going to go ace 8, 10 8, 7 6. Okay, these are barreling the turn. I want to show you the equity of these hands, right? As you can see here, we're around 65 to 70% equity, right, with second pair and third pair in this situation. And that's because obviously our opponent has ace high, right? That is their range at this point. If we rewind back to the flop, again, just to keep the equities in there to illustrate to you, if you remember 10s and jacks on the flop, they have basically the same equity, right? And they're check raising the flop to get it in, essentially. So if you think about jacks here, no one really would have too many qualms about check raising jacks or betting big with jacks on the flop, right? But a lot of people would struggle to find the ace 8s, right, or the 10 8s or the 7 6s of the world in this situation when, let's face it, essentially they're the same hand. It's kind of like having jacks on the flop here, right? It's always a good pro tip. If you're in the solver, check the equities tab and try to think a little bit more in this manner. Separate yourself from the fact that I have third pair, you know, or I have second pair, and try to think about the equity of your hand, and then the strategy, or the strategies overall will become generally a lot more clear. But this is just disgusting, right? It's absolutely disgusting how aggressive we get to be here. The 9's obviously a very, very good turn for the in position player because, look, we're stabbing a lot of this Broadway region. We've just improved our equity. We're stabbing a lot of pairs, which we're all doing very, very well, and so on and so on. 6 is betting the turn here for value, right? This isn't a bluff. This is just pure value, okay? And it's not, as I say, just limited to the 9 turn. Obviously, the 9 might be a bit more of an extreme one, but I could roll off just an offsuit 2, all right? And offsuit 2, we're going to be a little bit more polarized because the board is less connected at this point. But again, look at the frequency of bet. We're now 2/3 or check, and we're betting 63% of the time. And again, we're barreling 6s, for value. We're barreling all the 8x, like fist pump, bombing the life out of it with top pair in this situation. Yeah, sixes has 66% equity. It's quids in at the end of the day. So the logic in these spots is always, look, if you face a check call, they're very often Broadway and ace high heavy. Punish that with aggression with your turn barrels. All right. And as I say, it's not just 8-7-3. The board could be jack 7-3. I don't know. Jack 6-3, something like that. Right. Our opponent checks. Let me do jack 5-3. Just something where they've got a bit more of a checking range. No. Make it 2-tone then. I just want a little bit more check. That's more like it, right? So check, bet, again, aggressive check raise strategy, over pairs, top pairs, and so on. So then when they check call in the turn, let's do a 7. Let's do an 8, actually. All right, what is villain's range at this point? Once again, you can see the majority of it is this. Right, again, it's very, very, very ace high heavy. In fact, a lot of third pair as well. But let me ask you this. If you've got pocket 7s and you check call a flop, very natural thing to do, and you face a 2/3 pot bet on the turn, how happy are you? Are you delighted to continue? Are you delighted to press call again? No. Right, so the bulk of villain's range at this point is very weak and, as I say, very vulnerable to aggression. So on the 8 turn here, we're 2/3 or check, and look, they have to defend ace king. They have to defend some ace queen. They have to defend their ace 10 of hearts. They have to defend some 7s. They have to fold 6s. They have to call 6-5 and so on. This is horrible, right? It's absolutely horrible to face this. So you've got to pull the trigger. And again, still over 50%, right, on this turn. That's a lot of betting. And again, it's obviously a little bit more defined in this spot. We're not going quite as thin for value, but there are still hands like 8x finding their way in there. The top pairs do still pile the money in. 10 still drills the money in, and we'll probably go for stacks on the river, and so on and so on. This is not easy. As I say, it's not easy, but it becomes easier if you understand the fundamental concept of, as I say, bulk of villain's range. This is all the solver ever does, right? If you're ever worrying about, oh, I've arrived to the turn, I don't know what my strategy should be, just visualize where your opponent's range congregates around and then build a strategy to put it into indifference. That's all the solver ever does and allows you to brain solve any spot in the tree. It's great fun. So bringing it back to our presentation and our slide, be very conscious of the bulk of villain's range, construct your strategies to mess with that, understands that they're very, very, very capped, right? The solver is very, very capped here, and humans are too, so we have to be hyper aggressive, and likewise, don't overestimate your showdown value with ace highs. So if you look at ace 9, ace queen, ace 4, right, ace 4 is a gutter, I suppose, but these hands are still really aggressive. No one tends to bluff ace queen in this situation because it's like, well, it's ace queen. Why would I need to bet here, right? I'm just going to check back and then I'll probably shut it down. Ace 10, yeah, ace 10 of spades, not an easy one to find. Ace 9, just puring it, and so on and so on. And again, this is not limited to just a jack high board. Could be an 8 high board or 7 high board or whatever you want. Check call, 10 on the turn, right? Again, hyper aggressive, good turn as well, fit in position. All right, again, nearly a range bet, but again, look at this ace high, ace jack, a bit of ace queen again, ace 9, ace 4, and so on and so on. All right, so when you stab the flop with ace high, you can now think about the turn as being aggressive, right? So therefore, you can start to stab the flop according to the solver a little bit more with your ace high region, with, as I say, the comfort of knowing that, hey, I'm just going to blast it off. I've got ace queen here, sure, but I'm just going to blast it off. I'm going to force my opponent on the turn to fold ace king, right? And that's not a bad thing to do. Fold ace queen, fold ace king isn't a terrible situation when you have ace queen at the end of the day. So herein lies the turn barreling lesson. Let us move in to another lesson within the lesson, should we say. So the natural progression to all of this is to look at the river. So villain has check called the flop. We have barreled the turn and villain has check called again. Can we still follow through on the river? Now, baseline wise, oh yeah, we absolutely can do. Exploitatively, oh yeah, you absolutely can do. People do not like to call down in these spots. They're already extremely uncomfortable. And my biggest bit of advice to all of you here would be, don't let your passivity or your natural inclination to be passive allow your decisions, let's say, to be influenced here, right? We've got to detach ourselves from the fact that we were the pre-flop caller, right? We've got to detach ourselves from the fact that our villain might be trapping in this situation, even if they are, right, as they should every now and again. Doesn't mean we can't follow through on the river with both value very wide and with bluffs. And you have the permission to do so, all right? This is, I'm not even talking exploitatively at this point. It's just the baseline. The solver in this situation just understands that, hey, look, I'm still on the river versus a very capped range here. I'm going to go very, very thin for value. I'm going to go very, very wide with my bluffs. So we'll have a look at, as I say, some examples in the sim in a second, but go thinner than you might naturally want to, okay? Those second pairs and hands like that, they can shove the river, believe it or not. Do not see monsters under the bed and just convince yourself that this time your opponent has the trap. And hey, even if they do, it doesn't mean that your river shove was bad, right? Go thin here. There's not a lot of bad things that are going to happen to you. It takes a lot of discipline for human beings to check call the flop and then check call the turn with traps. A lot of discipline, and most don't have that. And if you think about this logically, look, if you arrive to the river with a range of value that is going to bet, again, extremely thin, that means you're allowed to follow through with your bluffs very, 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 very often. Okay, so in this situation, as I'll show you in a second, your bluff allowance, i.e. how often the solver is allowed to bluff, according to the maths of the spot, is really high, right? There aren't that many bad rivers. Okay, there are more good rivers in this situation than bad rivers, and therefore you're shoving thin for value anyway. Follow through with your bluffs, even though you might not want to, right? No one likes bluffing the river and getting called, but in this situation, it's an extremely profitable thing to do, which we'll illustrate now. So, the wizard, let's use this board still. Opponent check calls the flop. We B40 the turn, 10 turn, extremely good for us. As mentioned, you can see that we're betting 3/4 of our range. This is villain's check raising range, right, on the turn. You can see that, hey, once again, villain, if they do trap the flop with kings, they need to stick the money in now, right? If they do trap the flop with aces, hey, they need to stick the money in now. Reason being, and top pairs, so and 10x, right? Reason being is these hands have that magical 70 to 80% equity, right? If you have a hand like, yeah, I don't know, king 10, right, or something along those lines, you very often want to stick the money in on the turn because there's not many rivers, right, that you're really delighted to see, okay? So you can see in this situation, if you get the 9 of hearts river and you face a shove, you're meant to fold king 10, right? You're meant to fold jack 10. You're meant to fold aces every now and again as well, right? So these hands are kind of vulnerable. So basically on the turn as the out of position player, you need to respect that, right? And you need to stick the money in anyway. And people will. People are not check calling down here with aces or kings, right? They will raise the turn, I promise you that. The out of position players traps, again, it's a lot of discipline, right, on the turn. So if they have eights, right, sure. Okay, they're going to check call the turn because eights, right, has more equity. So this has 93%, or if they have fives, look at us, yeah, nearly 90%. So it's very, very different to having aces. And the idea is, look, if the river is the 9 of hearts and you face the jam, 8 still just slam dunk calls. Okay, so this is obviously one of the worst rivers in the deck, and this is a good like line of thinking if you are the out of position player. Look, if I'm going to just shut my eyes and call every river anyway, then I can trap the turn. If I can't, right, if my hand is value but vulnerable, it wants to fast play on the turn if it arrives there. So we'll do a brick first of all, but we'll roll off a few different rivers. What happens here then is out of position, arrives to the river once again with a range that is, hey, not strong. Really, really, really not strong. So they're going to arrive with ace 5. They're going to arrive with 7s. They're going to arrive with 6s. They're going to arrive with ace king. Okay. Again, this is the bulk of villain's range. So what happens if you are the button is, hey, look, you're shoving 60% nearly of your range on the river, and you are shoving all the way down to 9-8. Right? 9-8 here is 80% equity. Value. It's like having aces on the turn in this situation. Check, call, flop, check the turn. You face a bet. You've got aces, you're going to stick it in. If you've got 9-8, it's like having aces in that same spot. So, oh yeah, you can shove the river for value. No problems whatsoever. And the issue with out of position is their range, as mentioned, is this. And in order for them to meet the required defense frequency on the river, they can't pure fold it, right? So you can see on the river, they're meant to defend 25% of this region. That's not easy. It's not easy to just check call down here with 7s or 6s or ace 5 or 6-5, or very occasionally the ace king of hearts or whatever it might be, right? This is so hard to do, but it's required, unfortunately. And that obviously ignores the fact that, hey, if they've got second pair, so if they've got an 8 here, they literally can't fold, right? If they've got a 10, they literally can't fold, and so on and so on. But don't get the monsters under the bed. You know, every once in a while they might have a straight, every once in a while they might have a set, but it's only 10% of the time, right? That is not enough to influence your strategy to stop you from value betting 9s or 9-8 or ace 8 or whatever on the river, all right? You get to go extremely aggressive still. Now, with your bluffs, you can see once again, this is still extremely aggressive, right? Look, you've bet the flop at a decent frequency. You've basically range bet the turn, and you're still allowed to bluff nearly half of your bluffs on the river. And again, this is just down to the fact you've got so much value, right? So you're allowed to bluff the river with your jack 9s. Look, jack 9 of hearts, go in. Queen 9, king 9, ace 9, ace jack, look, so the ace jack on the turn that you did barrel, right? You can follow through on the river, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And I want to show you as well, like if you just look at jack 9 of hearts, for example, look at how much money this makes, right? It's not often that you arrive to the river with a bluff and you're making 8 big blinds bluffing the river. A lot of people would look at hearts and we naturally tend to go, oh, I've got a missed flush draw, I've got bad blockers, I'm going to tap the table and give up. No, it's making it 8 bigs to shove the river with jack 9 of hearts here. That's an incredible amount of money to make with one of your bluffs, okay? And, you know, even if you don't have an amazing bluff candidate like king queen or something like that, hey, it's not it's what's the best way of putting it? It's not losing with a lot of these hands to shove the river. It might be more, it might be higher EV to check, but if you do bomb the river, it's still making you money. It's not making you the most amount of money, but it's still making you money. So aggression is key in this spot, both with your bluffs and with your value. And again, just to show you a different texture, if we do, let's do something different. Let's do a paired board. Right, let's do 6-6-3. And I'll show you how wide we get to go here. So check, bet on the flop. Once again, opponent's meant to check raise over pairs extremely aggressively. Turn, we'll roll off. We'll even do a jack, right? Which is not necessarily an amazing turn for you as the in-position player. Hence, the out-of-position gets some lead. Right, but even if you get this situation, you're still betting 50% of the time. Bet, call, river, I don't know, 8. Check. Right, again, look, villain just has ace high, 50% of the time. In position, therefore, still extremely aggressive. The value thresholds are a little bit different here. Honestly, hands up, I'd probably shove 10s. But you're still extremely aggressive, and once again, bluff frequency really, really high. Queen 10, King 10, King 9, 10, 9, and so on and so on. And this is on one of the worst turns for you. Obviously, if we ran off again, one of the better ones, an 8, literally range bet the turn, right? And then I'll even give you a good river, 10, right? Again, ace high, 60% of the time, 65. Oof. There you go. So you can shove an 8. You can shove 9, 8 again on the river for value. And villain has to defend ace king. Actually, not ace queen. They have to defend ace queen. And ace jack. Right. You can shove ace 9 as a bluff. You can even get a little bit of ace jack in there as well. But again, just look how aggressive this is. Right. So herein lies the lesson, I guess. I'll keep it to this particular line because I've only got time for one video on this for the time being, but we're going to explore some different spots, hence it's a series. But look, if you slap the flop in position as the pre-flop caller in a 3-bet pot, understand the plan, understand its aggression, understand that most people underdo this, and don't be one of those guys. Stick it in their face with second pair, wish them all the best, and hey, they have to call third pair. They have to call ace high. Not easy to do that. Not comfortable in any way, shape or form. This is tough to play against, but this is your baseline. So, as I say, herein lies the lesson. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. As I say, we're going to look at a series of where you're letting them off the hook. We're going to continue along a similar sort of theme. So we're going to, as I say, hone in on lots of different spots where small stakes, mid stakes guys are continuously letting people off the hook, and I'm going to try and teach you not to do that anymore. If you enjoyed the video, obviously get at me in the comments below. If you've got any questions, same thing. But until then, hope you guys enjoy. See you all on the next.